Let me tell you what, if you're reading Amber, you are just never going to know where we're going or what's going to happen next. It is just a wild time. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we are going to be talking about the first arc in the Book of Amber, or the Chronicles of Amber, or however you want to style it, which is the Corwin cycle. And I didn't realize initially when getting this that the first 5 are the Corwin cycle and the next 5 are the Merlin cycle. So I'm actually technically only about halfway through this behemoth here, which is the first 10. But the first 5 were the original 5 books. They were done in the 70s, whereas the other ones after were done in the 80s. I've heard they're not quite as good as the first 5, but I'm definitely going to be curious to try. But yeah, after finishing, I did 1 and 2 together, 3 and 4 together, and then found out that 5 is the last one in the first arc. And I'm like, well, I got to finish that. So I ended up doing that rather quickly. And I'm glad I did, because with these books, they are all quite short, and I do think if I could go back, I would probably have just read them all much closer together, because this feels like a very episodic series. You are stopping and then picking up pretty much right where you leave off, and it just feels like something that I think reading close together and binging would work really, really well for. And so if you want like a shorter series to kind of go through, this probably works well for that as well. Granted, you get some reminders, and having a gap between, I didn't feel like I couldn't follow. I just feel like my experience, I might have had more fun with it just kind of doing it that way. So I may end up, whenever I get to the back half, I may end up just going in and doing all of those really, really close together. But yeah, this is a wild, wild time. I've talked about this a couple of times when I talked about the individual books and just described it as weird, which, for the record, when I say weird, I typically always mean that in a positive way. But this is so different, and it's very different from the kind of stuff that I'm used to. It is written in the 70s. In the 70s, I like to think in fantasy as kind of, in some ways, it's definitely not a 100% true statement, but in some ways it was a very experimental time. And you had some authors who were writing books that were just very different, very out there, and I've definitely found some stuff that I've liked, and that was totally not the norm. It also, in the 70s, you did have some of the clone things start going a very different direction, so we had some different branching pathways, but this definitely falls into the just kind of crazy and wild thing. And talking about the Book of Amber and the first 5 books, anyway, we're following Corwin, who is one of the 9 princes of Amber, but he wakes up in like a hospital and doesn't know who he is and is trying to figure it out. So we start with sort of that mystery of what's going on there, and we start to find out more and more about what Amber is in this world. The thing is, though, the setting here of Amber is so interesting, because Amber is deemed to be the only true like city, and that's the only thing that's real, and everything else are just these realms of shadows, and you can kind of pass through and end up in different worlds, different places. And it's, in here, like, our world seems to exist, but it's one of these like shadow worlds that's not really real. And you may have heard me say that the second half is called Merlin, and based on the the names, other names in the series too, you can kind of figure it out. Like book 2 is Guns of Avalon, so you can figure out there's going to be some of those things, but you can go to all of these different places where there are different people or creatures or things, and it's just, you get this unique look, because this is very much fantasy, but it has some sci-fi feel at some point. It has some just, like old school speculative fiction type of thing, where it's not quite fantasy, not quite sci-fi. This definitely feels like it's in that camp, where you had a lot of books before where there wasn't much of a thing. And that's partially why I think sci-fi and fantasy still get lumped together today, is in the kind of the roots of that, there wasn't as much of a divide. Books weren't just fantasy or sci-fi necessarily. It was kind of just this sci-fi fantasy mix, where there might be some fantastical elements, there might be some sci-fi elements, and this is sort of that. Like, it's very fantasy, but also it just is, it's not like traditional type of fantasy by any means either, and it's just a wild time all the way through. I mentioned we start with kind of the mystery of Corwin and trying to figure out who he is, but the mysteries don't really stop, because like I said in the intro, you just don't ever really know where this is going to go. The whole thing, you're figuring out what are the motivations of the other princes of Amber, who's on whose side, who's out to get who did what, and figuring out what's happened in the first book, as well as these other times. There are power plays. There's talk about the King of Amber, who is their father. There's talk about the Courts of Chaos, which are this other area where there's that. We travel. We do all of these different things. We see all of these super cool things, and it's just it is just kind of this zany, wild time where we're not really worried about what are the rules of like a fantasy book or a sci-fi book. We're just going out there and doing this. And so I think this is one of those series that, while this isn't going to end up being like a top 10 series or a favorite for me, I can see why people who read this would have this be a favorite, especially if you did at the time. It's just, especially reading this, and I have read a lot of older fantasy from the 60s on up for the most part only, but I've read a lot of the fantasy. I tend to like a lot of the books that are a little bit older than the modern books, but still coming from a modern reader. I find so many things here that I do wonder like what the reception would have been for this at the time, just because it's so different from anything that you find these days, but in a way that I think makes it unique and such a really interesting and cool series to experience. So it's definitely one I recommend checking out to experience if you just want to try something totally different. But it's super engaging in a fun way, and they do feel in some ways kind of like popcorn reads, just because they are short. They're very engaging. There's lots of action and intrigue, and it feels like something I said like to binge. I do recommend reading them all together. I think if you're going to do them, reading them close together at least, which isn't crazy because like this is a large book. This is a physical copy of, like I said, the whole 10, but only the first half is this book. So like in this copy, that's like 550-ish pages, which is, for 5 books, that's pretty short too. So it's not crazy, but I think reading them together would probably work. But just the imagination and the different worlds, that's the cool thing. And the very distinctive way that the author writes the traveling between like the shadows is something that just I feel like has really, really stuck with me, because every time it's like describing these fragments, and it's almost like some like offbeat poetry, just these things happening as you go through this world, and then there's this, and then there's that, and the descriptions. It's something about it. It's very evocative. It really just like brings the imagery, brings the feeling, the mystique, all of that. Like you feel like you're really going through these shadow worlds and don't know where you're going to end up. And it's just something that I have found to be just really unique. It's something that stands out a lot about this series. And the writing style itself doesn't feel particularly old or new. It's just kind of, it's a very like just normal kind of writing style, and feels very kind of casual in a lot of ways. So it's not to say like this is super thick or poetic, but just like here's an example of a completely random passage, which is a little bit longer. I'm just reading an excerpt of the way it's describing as they're kind of going through and traveling. Now a rippling glassy curtain to my right as the rain advances, blue fracture lines within the clouds, the temperature plummeting, our pace steady, the world a monochromatic backdrop now. Gonging thunder, flashing white, the curtain flaring toward us now. 200 meters, 150, enough. And so there's just kind of an example. It's like I said, it's almost this kind of different sort of a poetry or flow to it, but it's just those descriptions are the thing I think that stands out the most about this particular series. And it just feels so inventive and fresh, despite the fact that it's 50-ish years old at this point. It still just feels so unique and original, and is just delightfully weird in a very fascinating way. So that's really kind of where I landed here. This is a series that, again, I had heard of it. I got this omnibus and I just intended to try. And it's one of the reasons I really like trying older series like this, things that don't necessarily get talked about as much anymore, just because there's so much stuff out there. And this is one that I definitely recommend trying for yourself just to experience, because it is just a fascinating time and a wild ride to go through. Really, though, those are my thoughts on the Corwin cycle, the first 5 books of Amber by Roger Zelazny. Let me know your thoughts on this if you have read this, and or the back half as well here too, or if it's something that sounds interesting to you. Would love to hear from you. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the links in the description, as always, for the Patreon if you want to support what I do, as well as the Wizardly Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether any of these books, other books, really anything at all. It's a lot of fun, and we'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.